What if I told you that the people who claim to love you the most might be the very ones plotting to take everything you've worked for your entire life? What if the family you've sacrificed everything for sees you not as a person, but as a walking ATM with an expiration date? This is the story of Margaret Thompson, a 68-year-old widow whose generosity became her prison, and whose awakening would shake the very foundations of what we believe about unconditional love. Her journey from financial slave to fierce warrior will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty. And by the end of this story, you'll never look at your own relationships the same way again. Margaret had always believed that love meant giving until it hurt. After losing her husband David to cancer 3 years earlier, she poured all her grief, all her need to be needed, into supporting her only son, Michael, and his wife, Jessica. She convinced herself that every monthly rent payment of $800, every grocery bill, every emergency car repair was an investment in love. She told herself that this was what good mothers did, that this was how families worked. But what Margaret didn't realize was that she had become the architect of her own exploitation. The routine had become as predictable as sunrise. Every first of the month, Margaret would transfer $800 to Michael and Jessica's account for rent. Every week, she'd receive a text about some urgent expense, a medical bill, a car problem, something that required immediate financial intervention. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, would rush to her computer, log into her banking app, and send whatever amount they needed. She had become Pavlov's dog, conditioned to respond to their financial distress with immediate monetary relief. But Margaret's generosity went far beyond the monthly obligations. There were the birthday gifts, expensive electronics that cost more than her own monthly grocery budget. There were the anniversary presents, weekend getaways that Margaret helped finance while she stayed home eating canned soup to save money. There were the Christmas extravaganzas, where Margaret would spend hours shopping for the perfect gifts, wrapping them with care, only to receive a perfunctory thank you text in return. She had become a one-woman welfare system, and she didn't even realize it. The first crack in Margaret's carefully constructed delusion came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She had been scrolling through Facebook, something she rarely did, when she stumbled upon photos from Michael and Jessica's weekend in Napa Valley. Expensive wine tastings, 5-star restaurants, luxury hotel rooms with views that cost more per night than Margaret spent on food in a month. The photos were dated from the same weekend that Jessica had called her crying about being unable to afford groceries. Margaret stared at her phone screen, feeling something cold and sharp pierce through her chest. But like so many victims of emotional manipulation, she quickly rationalized it away. Maybe the trip had been a gift from someone else. Maybe they had used credit cards and would pay for it later. Maybe she was being paranoid. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and doubt has a way of growing in darkness. Margaret began to notice things she had previously ignored. The new designer handbag Jessica carried when they met for lunch. The same lunch where Jessica complained about not being able to afford her medications. The expensive sneakers on Michael's feet when he came to ask for help with utilities. The perfectly manicured nails on Jessica's hands as she signed the check Margaret had written to cover their car insurance. These weren't necessities. These were luxuries being purchased while Margaret lived on a budget tighter than a miser's fist. The breaking point came on a Friday evening that would forever divide Margaret's life into before and after. She had been planning for weeks to surprise Michael and Jessica with tickets to a Broadway show for their anniversary. She had saved for months, eating generic cereal for breakfast and skipping her weekly coffee dates with friends to afford the $300 tickets. She called Michael to tell him about the surprise, her voice bubbling with excitement at the thought of giving them something special, something that would create beautiful memories. Michael's response was like ice water poured over her enthusiasm. "Oh, Mom, that's really thoughtful, but we already have plans that night. Jessica's parents are taking us to that new steakhouse downtown, and then we're going to see Hamilton." Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows. They were going to see the same show she had planned to take them to, but with Jessica's parents. The parents who had never contributed a dime to their monthly expenses, who had never been the emergency contact for financial crises, who had never been treated like a personal bank. But the real devastation came next. "Jessica's dad surprised us with front row seats," Michael continued, oblivious to the knife he was twisting in his mother's heart. "He said we deserved something special for our anniversary." Margaret hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen, staring at the tickets she had sacrificed so much to buy. She realized in that moment that Jessica's father, who gave occasionally and spectacularly, was appreciated more than Margaret, who gave constantly and desperately. She was taken for granted precisely because she was always available, always willing, always saying yes. That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She looked at her bank statements, really looked at them, with the cold eye of an accountant rather than the warm heart of a mother. The numbers told a story that made her stomach turn. In the 3 years since David's death, she had given Michael and Jessica over $42,000. $42,000 of her retirement savings, of the life insurance money David had left to ensure her comfort in her golden years, of the nest egg they had built together through decades of careful saving and modest living. Margaret traced her finger down the endless list of transfers, each one representing a piece of her security, her future, her peace of mind. The monthly rent payments totaled $28,800. The emergency expenses, the car repairs, the medical bills, the utility payments, the grocery money, the insurance premiums, all of it added up to a sum that made her dizzy. She had funded their entire lifestyle while barely scraping by herself. She had become impoverished in service of their comfort. If you're watching this story unfold and recognizing patterns in your own life, I want you to pause this video and really think about the relationships around you. Are you being valued for who you are or for what you provide? Don't forget to hit that like button if this story is resonating with you, because Margaret's journey is about to take a turn that will shock you to your core. The revelation of the numbers was devastating, but what happened next would shatter Margaret's world completely. She decided to do something she had never done before. She decided to test the relationship. Margaret resolved to step back from the constant financial support and see what remained. She wanted to know if there was any love left when the money was removed from the equation. It was an experiment that would reveal truths more painful than she could have ever imagined. Margaret started small. When Jessica called about needing money for groceries, Margaret said she was having her own financial difficulties and couldn't help immediately. She expected concern, questions about her well-being, offers of assistance. Instead, Jessica's voice turned cold. "Well, when do you think you'll be able to help us? We're really counting on you." There was no inquiry about Margaret's problems, no expression of sympathy, no offer to help in return, just impatience about when the money would flow again. The pattern became clear quickly. When Margaret wasn't immediately available with financial assistance, the communication stopped entirely. No casual phone calls, no invitations to dinner, no text messages asking how she was doing. The silence was deafening and heartbreaking. Margaret realized that she had been living under the illusion of closeness while actually experiencing transactional relationships disguised as family bonds. But Margaret's awakening was about to accelerate in ways she never anticipated. 3 weeks into her experiment with financial boundaries, she received a call that would change everything. It was Jessica, and her voice had a tone Margaret had never heard before. Not the usual sweet manipulation when money was needed, not the casual dismissiveness when it wasn't. This was something else entirely, something desperate and angry. "Margaret, we need to talk," Jessica said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Michael and I have been discussing your recent behavior, and we're concerned about your mental state. You've been acting erratically, making poor financial decisions, and we think you might need professional help." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret's own daughter-in-law was questioning her sanity because she had dared to keep her own money. "What do you mean by erratic behavior?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jessica's response was a masterclass in gaslighting. "Well, you've always been so generous and caring, and suddenly you're being selfish and paranoid. You're making excuses about your finances when we know you have plenty of money. This kind of sudden personality change can be a sign of dementia or other mental health issues. We think you should see a doctor." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Margaret's decision to practice financial self-care was being reframed as mental illness. Her choice to prioritize her own security was being presented as evidence of cognitive decline. She was being gaslit by the very people she had sacrificed everything to support, and the cruelty of it took her breath away. But Jessica wasn't finished. "Michael and I have been talking to a lawyer about options for people in your situation. There are ways to ensure that you get the help you need, even if you don't think you need it. We're prepared to take legal action if necessary to protect you from yourself. The threat was clear. If Margaret didn't resume the financial support, they would try to have her declared mentally incompetent. They would attempt to gain legal control over her money through the courts. Margaret hung up the phone with hands that trembled not from fear, but from rage. The people she had impoverished herself to support were now threatening to strip her of her legal rights because she had stopped funding their lifestyle. They weren't just ungrateful, they were predatory. They had revealed themselves to be financial parasites, willing to destroy her autonomy to maintain their comfortable existence. That night, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not go quietly into the night. She would not allow herself to be manipulated, threatened, or legally victimized by people who saw her as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. If Michael and Jessica wanted a war, she would give them one. But it would be a war fought with intelligence, documentation, and the cold fury of a woman who had finally seen the truth. Margaret's first call the next morning was to Robert Chen, an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. She had found him online, reading testimonials from other seniors who had been financially exploited by family members. His office was modern and professional, and Robert himself was a serious man in his 50s who listened to Margaret's story with the focused attention of someone who had heard similar tales too many times. "Mrs. Thompson," Robert said when Margaret finished her account, "what you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse. The fact that they're threatening to have you declared incompetent when you assert financial boundaries is particularly concerning. This is a common tactic used by abusive family members to regain control over their victims' resources." His words were both validating and terrifying. Margaret was officially a victim of elder abuse, perpetrated by her own son. Robert outlined the steps they would need to take to protect Margaret from further exploitation. First, they would document everything, every transfer, every demand, every threat. Second, they would prepare for the possibility of an incompetency hearing, gathering medical and psychological evaluations to prove Margaret's mental acuity. Third, they would consider seeking a restraining order if the harassment continued. "Mrs. Thompson," Robert concluded, "I want you to understand that this is going to get worse before it gets better. When financial abusers realize their victim is fighting back, they often escalate their tactics." As if summoned by Robert's prediction, Margaret's phone rang that afternoon. It was Michael, and his voice had a coldness she had never heard from her own child. "Mom, Jessica told me about your conversation yesterday. I'm disappointed in you. We've always been able to count on your support, and now you're turning your back on us when we need you most. This isn't like you. I think Jessica might be right about you needing to see someone." Margaret felt something crystallize inside her chest, something hard and unforgiving. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. In the 3 years since your father died, I have given you over $42,000. I have paid your rent, your groceries, your emergencies, your luxuries. I have impoverished myself to maintain your lifestyle. And now, when I finally decide to keep my own money for my own needs, you and your wife are questioning my sanity." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. "Michael," Margaret continued, "I am not mentally ill. I am not incompetent. I am a woman who has finally realized that she has been enabling 2 adults who should have been supporting themselves years ago. The money stops now, permanently." Michael's response revealed the depth of his sense of entitlement. "Mom, you can't just cut us off like this. We have obligations, responsibilities. We've built our life around your support. You can't just abandon us." The word abandon hit Margaret like a slap. She was abandoning them by keeping her own money. She was abandoning them by refusing to continue financing their adult lives. "Michael," Margaret said, her voice now ice cold, "the only person who has been abandoned here is me. Abandoned by a son who sees his mother as a bank account with legs. Abandoned by a daughter-in-law who threatens legal action when the money stops flowing. You want to talk about abandonment? You abandoned me emotionally years ago. You just kept the financial relationship going." The conversation ended with Michael hanging up on her, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. The pretense was over. The masks had fallen away. She could finally see her relationships clearly, without the distortion of hope and delusion. It was painful, but it was also liberating. Over the next few days, the harassment intensified exactly as Robert had predicted. Margaret received calls from numbers she didn't recognize, all variations of the same theme. She was being selfish. She was mentally declining. She needed help. She was hurting the people who loved her most. The emotional manipulation was relentless and sophisticated, designed to break down her resolve and restore the previous dynamic. But Margaret had something now that she hadn't possessed before: clarity. She could see the manipulation techniques for what they were. The guilt trips, the false concern, the veiled threats, all of it was just a variation on the same basic strategy. Make Margaret believe that keeping her own money was wrong, that prioritizing her own well-being was selfish, that saying no to financial demands was evidence of mental illness. Margaret's transformation was just beginning, and what happened next would test every ounce of her newfound strength. But here's what you need to understand about this moment in her story. When Margaret finally saw the truth, she didn't just see it about Michael and Jessica. She saw it about herself. She realized that she had been complicit in her own exploitation, that her need to be needed had made her vulnerable to manipulation, that her fear of abandonment had created the very abandonment she feared most. If you've ever found yourself giving until it hurts, supporting people who only call when they need something, or questioning your own worth based on how much you can provide for others, then share this video with someone who needs to hear Margaret's story. Her journey is far from over, and what happens next will either destroy her completely or forge her into someone stronger than she ever imagined possible. The legal threat that Jessica had made wasn't just bluster. 2 weeks after Margaret's phone call with Michael, a stranger appeared at her door. He was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that made Margaret's skin crawl. He introduced himself as Dr. Franklin Pierce, a psychiatrist who specialized in geriatric mental health assessments. "Mrs. Thompson," he said in a voice that dripped with false compassion, "your family has expressed concerns about your mental state and has requested that I conduct an evaluation. I understand there have been some recent changes in your behavior that have them worried." Margaret stared at this man who had come to her home uninvited, who was proposing to examine her mind at the request of people who wanted access to her bank account. "Dr. Pierce," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I did not request an evaluation. I did not consent to an evaluation, and I want you to leave my property immediately." But Dr. Pierce was persistent, using language designed to make Margaret doubt herself. "Mrs. Thompson, resistance to mental health evaluation can itself be a symptom of cognitive decline. Your family loves you and wants what's best for you. Surely you want to put their minds at ease." This was the moment when Margaret truly understood the sophistication of the attack against her. They weren't just trying to manipulate her emotionally anymore. They were trying to use the medical and legal systems to strip her of her autonomy. Dr. Pierce's presence at her door was the first shot in a campaign to have her declared mentally incompetent, and Margaret realized that her very freedom was at stake. Margaret called Robert Chen immediately after Dr. Pierce left. "They're moving faster than I expected," Robert told her. "The fact that they brought a psychiatrist to your home without your consent is actually helpful for our case. It shows the aggressive nature of their campaign against you. But Margaret, you need to understand what you're facing. If they can convince a judge that you're mentally incompetent, they can gain guardianship over you. That would give them complete control over your finances and your life." The reality of her situation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her own son was willing to have her declared legally insane to regain access to her money. This wasn't just greed. This was a form of violence. They were attempting to strip her of her fundamental rights as a human being, to reduce her to a ward of the state under their control. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. But Margaret's ordeal was about to intensify in ways that would test every fiber of her being. The next phase of Michael and Jessica's campaign was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. They began reaching out to Margaret's neighbors, her friends, anyone who knew her, expressing concern about her mental state and asking if they had noticed any changes in her behavior. Mrs. Henderson from next door called Margaret one afternoon, her voice full of worry. "Margaret, dear, your son called me today. He's concerned about you. He said you've been acting strangely and that you might be developing dementia. He asked me to keep an eye on you and report back if I noticed anything concerning." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. Michael and Jessica were building a narrative of mental decline, creating a web of supposed witnesses who could testify to her incompetence. The isolation campaign was equally sophisticated. Margaret's weekly bridge games suddenly stopped when Jessica called the other ladies to express concern about Margaret's mental state. Her volunteer work at the local library was disrupted when Michael contacted the coordinator to suggest that Margaret might not be fit for duties that required mental acuity. One by one, the social connections that had sustained Margaret through her widowhood were being severed by her own family members who were portraying themselves as concerned caregivers. Margaret began to understand that she was experiencing a form of psychological terrorism designed to break down her sense of reality and her support network. The goal wasn't just to regain control of her money, it was to make her doubt her own sanity, to make her believe that perhaps she really was incompetent, that perhaps she really did need someone else to make decisions for her. But Margaret had one advantage that Michael and Jessica hadn't counted on. 3 years of grief had taught her something about herself that she had never known before. She was stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for, including herself. The woman who had raised a child alone after her husband's death, who had managed a household budget for 50 years, who had worked 2 jobs to put Michael through college, that woman was still inside her, and she was angry. Margaret's counterattack began with documentation. She started keeping a detailed journal of every contact from Michael, Jessica, Dr. Pierce, and anyone else involved in their campaign. She saved every voicemail, every text message, every email. She photographed Dr. Pierce's business card and noted the time and date of his uninvited visit. She was building a case, piece by piece, that would demonstrate the systematic nature of the harassment she was experiencing. But documentation wasn't enough. Margaret needed allies, people who could testify to her mental competence and good character. She began reaching out to people who knew her well, explaining the situation and asking for their support. Her longtime physician, Dr. Sarah Martinez, was appalled when Margaret explained what was happening. "Margaret, I've been your doctor for 15 years. You are sharp as a tack. If anyone tries to question your mental competence, I will be happy to testify on your behalf." Margaret's accountant, James Wilson, was equally supportive. "Mrs. Thompson, you've managed your finances responsibly for decades. The idea that you're suddenly incompetent is absurd. Your recent decision to stop funding your son's lifestyle shows good financial judgment, not mental decline." One by one, Margaret assembled a team of professionals who knew her well and could speak to her competence and character. The turning point in Margaret's fight came when she discovered something that changed everything. While organizing her financial records for Robert, she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in Michael's old room, in a box of his college papers that she had kept for sentimental reasons, she found documents that revealed the true scope of his betrayal. There were printouts of her bank statements going back 2 years, statements that Michael should never have had access to. There were notes in his handwriting calculating her net worth, estimating how long her money would last at current spending levels, analyzing the value of her house and her life insurance policies. Most damning of all, there was a letter from a financial advisor outlining strategies for managing elderly parents' assets to prevent irresponsible spending while ensuring family security. Margaret sat on the floor of Michael's old room, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so profound that it took her breath away. Her son hadn't just been taking her money. He had been studying her finances like a predator stalking prey. He had been planning for this confrontation, preparing strategies to maintain control over her assets even if she tried to resist. The spontaneous concern about her mental health wasn't spontaneous at all. It was a calculated plan, developed over months or possibly years. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. In the same box, Margaret found a copy of a will that she had never seen before. It was her will, or rather, a version of her will that had been modified without her knowledge. Someone had used her personal information to create a document that left everything to Michael immediately upon her death, bypassing the original provisions she had made for charities and friends. The forgery was sophisticated enough that it might have been accepted by a probate court if she had died suddenly. Margaret realized in that moment that she wasn't just fighting for her financial independence. She was fighting for her life. Michael and Jessica weren't just trying to control her money while she was alive. They were positioning themselves to inherit everything when she died. And given the level of planning and manipulation they had already demonstrated, Margaret had to consider the possibility that they might not be content to wait for natural causes. The weight of this revelation was almost unbearable. Margaret had given birth to Michael, raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally, and in return, he had been planning to steal her life's work and possibly hasten her death. The person she trusted most in the world had become her greatest enemy, and she had been funding his campaign against her for years. That night, Margaret made a decision that would define the final chapter of her life. She would not just defend herself against Michael and Jessica's attacks. She would go on the offensive. She would expose their crimes, protect other vulnerable seniors from similar exploitation, and ensure that they faced consequences for what they had done to her. The war they had started would end with their complete and total defeat. But first, Margaret had to survive the immediate threat. The forged will and the financial surveillance revealed that this was not just about money. This was about power, control, and possibly even murder. Margaret realized that she was in genuine physical danger from her own family, and that realization changed everything about how she would fight back. If you're thinking this story couldn't possibly get more shocking, you're wrong. Margaret's fight for survival is just beginning, and what she discovers next will reveal a network of abuse that extends far beyond her own family. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because Margaret's story is about to take a turn that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family, trust, and the lengths people will go to for money. Margaret's discovery of the forged will and financial surveillance documents transformed her from a defensive victim into an offensive warrior. She understood now that this wasn't just about stopping the harassment. It was about exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatened her very existence. Her first call was to Robert Chen, and his reaction confirmed her worst fears. "Margaret, what you've found is evidence of elder fraud, identity theft, and possibly conspiracy to commit murder," Robert said, his voice grim. "The forged will alone is a felony. The unauthorized access to your financial information is another crime. And the systematic campaign to have you declared incompetent while positioning themselves as your heirs? That's a pattern that suggests premeditation for something much worse than financial theft." Robert's next words chilled Margaret to the bone. "I've seen cases like this before, Margaret. When the financial manipulation fails, when the legal intimidation doesn't work, some families escalate to more direct methods. You need to consider the possibility that your life is in danger." Margaret had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by a legal professional made it terrifyingly real. The plan Robert outlined was comprehensive and aggressive. First, they would file criminal charges against Michael and Jessica for the crimes they had already committed. Second, they would seek a restraining order to prevent further contact or harassment. Third, they would work with law enforcement to investigate the possibility of additional crimes. And fourth, they would take steps to protect Margaret's physical safety while the legal process unfolded. Margaret's transformation accelerated as she embraced her new role as a crime fighter rather than a victim. She installed a security system in her house, complete with cameras and automatic alerts to the police. She changed all her locks and gave keys only to Robert and Dr. Martinez. She opened new bank accounts at a different institution and transferred her assets to accounts that Michael and Jessica couldn't access or monitor. But Margaret's most important weapon in this fight was something that Michael and Jessica had never counted on: her intelligence. They had dismissed her as a confused old woman who could be easily manipulated, but Margaret was sharp, organized, and now highly motivated. She began building a case against them with the methodical precision of a prosecutor. Margaret's investigation into her own exploitation revealed layers of deception that astounded even Robert. She discovered that Michael had been forging her signature on documents for over a year, including loan applications that used her house as collateral. Jessica had been using Margaret's personal information to open credit cards in her name, running up debt that Margaret knew nothing about. The financial abuse was far more extensive than even Margaret had realized. The evidence was overwhelming, but Margaret knew that Michael and Jessica wouldn't surrender easily. Their response to her criminal complaints was swift and vicious. They accelerated their competency campaign, now claiming that Margaret's accusations were evidence of paranoid delusions. They brought in more medical professionals willing to question her mental state, based solely on their accusations. Dr. Pierce returned, this time with a court order requiring Margaret to submit to a mental health evaluation. The order had been obtained using false statements about Margaret's behavior, but it was legally binding nonetheless. Margaret found herself in the surreal position of having to prove her sanity to prevent her son from gaining legal control over her life and assets. The competency hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December. Margaret spent weeks preparing with Robert and a team of expert witnesses who would testify to her mental acuity. Dr. Martinez conducted comprehensive cognitive testing that confirmed Margaret's excellent mental function. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations, interviewed Margaret extensively and concluded that she showed no signs of mental impairment whatsoever. But Michael and Jessica had assembled their own team of experts, professionals who were willing to testify that Margaret's accusations against her family were evidence of paranoid delusions, that her decision to cut off financial support showed poor judgment, and that her resistance to help from her loved ones indicated a dangerous lack of insight into her condition. The hearing was a battleground where Margaret's life and freedom hung in the balance. Michael testified with tears in his eyes about his beloved mother's tragic decline, claiming that she had become suspicious, paranoid, and unable to make rational decisions. Jessica supported his testimony with her own account of Margaret's supposed deterioration, painting herself as a devoted daughter-in-law who only wanted what was best for the family matriarch. But when Margaret took the stand, she was magnificent. She calmly and methodically presented the evidence of her son's crimes, explaining how she had discovered the forged documents, the unauthorized financial monitoring, and the systematic campaign to isolate her from her support network. She answered every question with precision and clarity, demonstrating the sharp mind that Michael and Jessica were trying to have declared incompetent. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Not only did he deny the petition for guardianship, but he also referred the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Margaret had won more than just her freedom. She had secured justice for the crimes committed against her. But the victory came at a cost that Margaret hadn't fully anticipated. The legal process had exposed the complete absence of love in her relationship with Michael and Jessica. There was no possibility of reconciliation, no hope for rebuilding what had been destroyed. Margaret had gained her freedom, but she had lost her family in the process. The criminal trial that followed was a media sensation. The story of a son and daughter-in-law who had systematically exploited and abused an elderly widow, then tried to have her declared insane when she fought back, captured the public imagination. Margaret became an unlikely celebrity, a symbol of resistance against elder abuse and family exploitation. Michael and Jessica were convicted on multiple charges including fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. They were sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $150,000 to Margaret, triple the amount they had stolen to account for damages and legal costs. But more importantly, their convictions would serve as a deterrent to other potential elder abusers and as validation for Margaret's courage in fighting back. As Margaret stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by reporters and supporters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been a grieving widow who believed that love meant giving until it hurt. She had been manipulated, exploited, and nearly destroyed by the people she trusted most, but she had survived, fought back, and won. Margaret's story didn't end with the trial. She used her experience and her settlement money to establish the Thompson Foundation for Elder Protection, an organization that provides legal assistance and support services to seniors facing family exploitation. She became a national advocate for elder rights, speaking at conferences and working with lawmakers to strengthen protections for vulnerable older adults. The foundation's work revealed that Margaret's experience was far from unique. Thousands of seniors across the country were being financially exploited by family members, isolated from support networks, and threatened with false competency proceedings when they tried to resist. Margaret's case had opened a window into a hidden epidemic of elder abuse that society had largely ignored. But perhaps Margaret's greatest achievement was personal rather than public. She had reclaimed her life, her autonomy, and her sense of self-worth. She had learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, between family and emotional predators, between genuine care and calculated manipulation. She had discovered that she was stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for, including herself. Margaret's new life was fuller and more satisfying than anything she had experienced since David's death. She traveled extensively, taking trips she had postponed while funding Michael's lifestyle. She developed new friendships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. She pursued hobbies and interests that had been abandoned during her years of exploitation. She had found something that had eluded her for years: genuine happiness. The last chapter of Margaret's story is perhaps the most important. 5 years after the trial, she received a letter from Michael in prison. It was an apology, or at least an attempt at one. He claimed to have found religion, to have realized the error of his ways, to be genuinely sorry for what he had done to her. He asked for forgiveness and hinted at the possibility of reconciliation when he was released. Margaret read the letter twice, then placed it in her fireplace and watched it burn. She had learned something crucial about forgiveness. It didn't require reconciliation with the person who had wronged you. She could forgive Michael for her own peace of mind while still protecting herself from further exploitation. She could release the anger and resentment that had once consumed her without opening herself up to future abuse. Margaret Thompson died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by friends who loved her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Her estate was distributed according to her wishes, half to the Thompson Foundation and half to the many charities and individuals who had supported her during her darkest hours. Michael and Jessica, still struggling to rebuild their lives after prison, received nothing. But Margaret's true legacy wasn't financial. It was the example she had set, the courage she had shown, and the thousands of other seniors who had been inspired by her story to stand up against their own abusers. She had transformed her personal tragedy into a public triumph, her individual suffering into collective strength. Margaret's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, love, and money. It challenges us to examine our own relationships and ask difficult questions. Are we valued for who we are or what we provide? Are we giving out of love or out of fear? Are we enabling healthy independence or unhealthy dependence in the people we care about? Most importantly, Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim our power, to set boundaries, and to demand the respect we deserve. Age doesn't disqualify us from autonomy. Generosity doesn't obligate us to accept abuse. Love doesn't require us to sacrifice our well-being for others' comfort. Margaret Thompson's journey from victim to victor, from exploitation to empowerment, stands as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of one person to change not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to say no, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is standing up to the people who claim to love us most. In a world where elder abuse affects millions of seniors annually, where families often see elderly relatives as resources rather than people, Margaret's story shines as a beacon of hope. It proves that even in our most vulnerable moments, even when betrayed by those closest to us, we have the power to fight back, to reclaim our dignity, and to create something meaningful from our suffering. The next time someone tries to make you feel guilty for protecting your own interests, the next time someone questions your judgment for setting boundaries, the next time someone suggests that your resistance to exploitation is evidence of your incompetence, remember Margaret Thompson. Remember that true love doesn't demand financial sacrifice, that real family doesn't threaten legal action, and that genuine care doesn't require you to impoverish yourself for others' benefit. Margaret's final words, spoken to a room full of elder advocates just months before her death, serve as both a warning and an inspiration. I spent 70 years believing that my worth was measured by what I could give to others. I almost lost everything before I learned that my worth was inherent, that my value didn't depend on my usefulness, and that the greatest gift I could give to the world was a strong, independent, self-respecting woman who refused to be anyone's victim. Those words echo still, carried forward by every senior who finds the courage to say no, every family member who chooses respect over exploitation, and every person who recognizes that Margaret Thompson's story is not just about one woman's triumph over abuse, but about the fundamental human right to dignity, autonomy, and respect, regardless of age or vulnerability. Margaret's legacy lives on in ways she never could have imagined. The Thompson Foundation has helped over 10,000 seniors escape financial exploitation, trained thousands of legal professionals to recognize elder abuse, and lobbied successfully for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret's story has become a cultural touchstone, a reference point that helps people identify and resist manipulation in their own lives. The ripple effects of Margaret's courage extend far beyond the realm of elder abuse. Her story has inspired adult children to examine their own relationships with aging parents, asking themselves whether they're providing genuine care or simply positioning themselves for inheritance. It has encouraged financial institutions to implement better safeguards against elder fraud. It has motivated healthcare professionals to look more carefully for signs of family exploitation among their elderly patients. Margaret's transformation also speaks to a broader truth about human resilience that transcends age and circumstance. Her journey from victim to victor demonstrates that we are never too old to change, never too set in our ways to learn new truths about ourselves and others, never too damaged to heal and grow stronger. The woman who died peacefully at 78 was fundamentally different from the woman who had been writing checks to Michael and Jessica at 68, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she had changed. The psychological aspects of Margaret's story reveal important insights about the nature of manipulation and recovery. Her initial vulnerability to exploitation wasn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It was the natural result of grief, loneliness, and a lifetime of conditioning that taught her to equate love with giving. Her recovery required not just legal action and financial protection, but a complete rewiring of her understanding of relationships and self-worth. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who worked extensively with Margaret during her legal battle, later wrote about the case in professional journals. Margaret's recovery demonstrates that healing from emotional abuse requires more than just removing yourself from the abusive situation, Dr. Williams explained. It requires rebuilding your sense of identity independent of the abuser's narrative about you. Margaret had to learn to see herself as valuable beyond her utility to others, worthy of respect regardless of her willingness to provide financial support. The social implications of Margaret's story are equally profound. Her case highlighted a hidden epidemic of elder abuse that affects an estimated 5 million seniors annually in the United States alone. Most cases never come to light because victims are either too ashamed to report the abuse, too isolated to seek help, or too psychologically damaged to recognize that they're being victimized. Margaret's willingness to go public with her story gave voice to countless silent victims and helped normalize the conversation about family financial exploitation. Margaret's advocacy work in her final years focused particularly on the intersection of elder abuse and social isolation. She recognized that her own vulnerability had been amplified by her loneliness after David's death, and that social connection was one of the most powerful tools for preventing exploitation. The Foundation's community outreach programs were designed not just to identify abuse after it occurred, but to prevent it by building supportive networks around vulnerable seniors. The educational aspects of Margaret's legacy continue to evolve. Law schools now use her case as a teaching tool for courses on elder law and family dynamics. Medical schools include her story in training about recognizing signs of abuse in elderly patients. Social work programs analyze her case to understand the complex dynamics of family exploitation and recovery. Margaret's experience has become a textbook example of how abuse develops, how it can be recognized, and how it can be successfully challenged. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Margaret's legacy is the way her story continues to inspire individual acts of courage. Letters pour into the Thompson Foundation from seniors who found the strength to leave abusive situations, adult children who recognized and stopped their own exploitative behavior, and professionals who were motivated to take action on behalf of vulnerable clients. Margaret's courage has created a cascade of courage in others, proving that one person's decision to stand up against injustice can inspire thousands of others to do the same. The financial industry has also been transformed by Margaret's case, and others like it. Banks now have more sophisticated systems for detecting unusual transaction patterns that might indicate elder abuse. Financial advisors receive training on recognizing signs of family exploitation. Investment firms have implemented policies requiring additional verification when elderly clients make large or unusual transactions. Margaret's exploitation led to systemic changes that protect millions of other seniors from similar abuse. Margaret's story also illuminates the complex relationship between aging and autonomy in American society. Her case challenged ageist assumptions about cognitive decline and decision-making capacity in older adults. It demonstrated that accusations of incompetence are often weaponized by younger family members seeking to gain control over elderly relatives' resources. Margaret's successful defense of her mental capacity helped establish important legal precedents, protecting the autonomy rights of seniors. The spiritual dimensions of Margaret's journey cannot be overlooked. Her transformation involved not just legal and financial changes, but a fundamental shift in her understanding of love, worth, and purpose. She had to release deeply held beliefs about maternal duty and family loyalty that had been used against her. She had to learn to see herself through her own eyes rather than through the eyes of people who valued her only for what she could provide. Margaret's relationship with forgiveness evolved throughout her journey in ways that offer important lessons for anyone who has been betrayed by family members. Her initial impulse was to forgive quickly and completely, to restore relationships and pretend that the abuse had never happened. But she learned that premature forgiveness could be another form of self-harm, a way of avoiding the difficult work of setting boundaries and demanding accountability. True forgiveness, Margaret discovered, didn't require her to subject herself to further abuse. She could forgive Michael and Jessica for her own emotional health while still maintaining protective boundaries. She could release her anger and resentment without opening herself up to continued exploitation. This nuanced understanding of forgiveness became a central part of her advocacy work and helped many other abuse survivors navigate their own complex feelings about family reconciliation. The legal reforms inspired by Margaret's case continue to evolve and expand. Her story was instrumental in the passage of stronger elder abuse reporting requirements for healthcare professionals and financial institutions. It helped establish specialized elder abuse courts in several states, creating a more supportive environment for elderly victims seeking justice. It contributed to the development of new technologies for detecting and preventing financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Margaret's impact on popular culture extends beyond legal and social reforms. Her story has been adapted into documentaries, true crime podcasts, and educational materials that reach millions of people who might never encounter formal elder abuse training. These cultural representations help normalize conversations about family financial exploitation and encourage people to recognize warning signs in their own lives or the lives of people they care about. The international implications of Margaret's story have also been significant. Elder abuse experts from around the world have studied her case and implemented similar legal and social reforms in their own countries. The Thompson Foundation has provided consultation and training to organizations fighting elder abuse in dozens of nations. Margaret's local struggle against family exploitation has become a global movement for elder rights and dignity. As we reflect on Margaret Thompson's extraordinary journey from victim to victor, from exploitation to empowerment, we're reminded that heroism often emerges from the most unlikely circumstances. Margaret didn't set out to become a crusader for elder rights or a symbol of resistance against family abuse. She simply reached a point where she could no longer tolerate being treated as less than human by the people who claimed to love her most. Her story challenges us to examine our own relationships with ruthless honesty. Are we giving freely or out of fear? Are we being valued for who we are or what we can provide? Are we enabling healthy independence or unhealthy dependence in the people we care about? These questions are uncomfortable, but they're essential for anyone who wants to build relationships based on genuine love rather than exploitation. Margaret's legacy reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim our power, to set boundaries, and to demand the respect we deserve. Age doesn't disqualify us from autonomy. Generosity doesn't obligate us to accept abuse. Family relationships don't exempt anyone from basic standards of decency and respect. These truths seem obvious when stated plainly, but they're often obscured by manipulation, tradition, and our own desperate need to be loved. The final lesson of Margaret Thompson's remarkable life is perhaps the most important, that our worth as human beings is inherent and immutable, not dependent on our usefulness to others or our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for their comfort. Margaret spent 70 years believing that her value was contingent on what she could give, how much she could sacrifice, how useful she could be to others. Only in her final decade did she discover that her worth was absolute, that she deserved love and respect simply by virtue of being human. That discovery transformed not just Margaret's life, but the lives of countless others who were inspired by her courage to claim their own inherent worth. In a world that often treats elderly people as burdens rather than blessings, that sees vulnerability as an invitation for exploitation rather than an opportunity for genuine care, Margaret Thompson's story stands as a powerful reminder that every person, regardless of age or circumstance, deserves to live with dignity, autonomy, and respect. Her voice continues to echo in courtrooms where elder abuse cases are tried, in support groups where survivors share their stories, in legislative halls where laws are written to protect the vulnerable, and in the hearts of everyone who has ever felt worthless, exploited, or forgotten. Margaret Thompson may be gone, but her revolution continues, carried forward by every person who chooses courage over compliance, dignity over dependence, and self-respect over the desperate hope that others will love us if we just give enough. In the end, Margaret's story is not just about elder abuse or family exploitation. It's about the fundamental human capacity for transformation, the power of truth to triumph over manipulation, and the courage that can emerge when we finally decide that we deserve better than we've been accepting. It's a story about growing stronger rather than smaller as we age, about claiming power rather than surrendering it, and about discovering that the most radical act of love is sometimes learning to love ourselves enough to say no. Margaret Thompson's legacy lives on, not in stone monuments or bronze plaques, but in every senior who refuses to be exploited, every family that chooses respect over manipulation, and every person who recognizes that true love never requires us to sacrifice our dignity or our autonomy. Her story reminds us that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by suffering, and revealed in moments when we must choose between surrender and resistance. Margaret chose resistance, and in doing so, she didn't just save herself. She saved thousands of others who found in her story the courage to save themselves. And perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to her remarkable life, that her personal victory over exploitation became a public triumph over injustice, that her individual courage inspired collective change, and that her decision to fight back became a beacon of hope for everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of those who claim to love them. The revolution Margaret Thompson started in a small courtroom continues in living rooms and law offices, in family conversations and congressional hearings, wherever people gather to affirm the simple but radical truth that every human being, regardless of age or vulnerability, deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and genuine love. Her story will continue to inspire and empower as long as there are people who need to be reminded that they are worth fighting for, that they deserve better than exploitation, and that it's never too late to reclaim their power and transform their lives.